My name is Serafina. I am 34 years old. I stood in the back of a packed courtroom, handcuffed and wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, as the judge prepared to sentence me to 10 years for medical malpractice and embezzlement. Sitting in the front row was my own mother, weeping fake tears of grief, holding hands with my fiancé. Beside them was my younger sister, wearing my engagement ring. They thought they had successfully destroyed my career, stolen my future husband, and locked me away forever. They had absolutely no idea that the stolen medical funds they framed me for were tied directly to an offshore life insurance policy. And when the judge banged his gavel, he didn't sentence me to prison. He ordered the FBI to seal the exits and arrest my family for conspiracy to commit murder. I want you to freeze the frame right there. Look closely at the woman in the orange jumpsuit, her wrists bound by heavy steel chains, standing before a federal judge. To the jury, the press, and the dozens of former colleagues whispering in the gallery, I was a disgraced neurosurgeon, a monster who had stolen millions from a pediatric research fund to finance a secret, lavish lifestyle. Now, look at the front row. Look at my mother, Lucille, dabbing her perfectly powdered cheeks with a tissue, playing the role of the devastated, broken-hearted matriarch to absolute perfection. Look at Julian, the man who had kissed me and promised me forever, squeezing my mother's hand in a show of supportive grief. And look at my sister, Isla, desperately trying to hide a triumphant, sociopathic smirk behind her hands, the diamond ring I had paid for glittering on her finger. They had engineered a flawless, devastating public execution. They had stripped me of my medical license, my reputation, my freedom, and my future. They expected me to sob, to beg for mercy, to collapse onto the cold hardwood floor of the courtroom. They had absolutely no idea that I wasn't standing there as a victim. I was standing there as the bait. And by showing up to gloat at my sentencing, they had just walked willingly into a federal slaughterhouse. But to understand how a high-profile medical embezzlement trial ended with the entire front row being hauled away in federal handcuffs, we need to rewind. Before I take you back to the exact moment this horrific psychological assassination began, please take a quick second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, but only if you believe that karma is best served ice-cold, legally binding, and with a side of absolute truth. Also, drop a comment down below and let me know. Where in the world are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? I read every single one. Now let me tell you how I became the quiet, devastating architect of my toxic family's total ruin. Long before the sterile courtrooms, the federal indictments, and the orange jumpsuits, my life was defined by the harsh, exhausting reality of being the designated workhorse in a family obsessed with the illusion of upper-class superiority. I grew up in an imposing, aggressively manicured house in the affluent suburbs of Chicago. From the outside, my mother, Lucille, projected an image of perfect, untouchable respectability. She was a socialite whose full-time job was maintaining appearances, hosting charity luncheons, and pretending we were far richer than we actually were. My father had passed away when I was young, leaving behind a mountain of secret debt that Lucille desperately tried to outrun. Inside the walls of our home, the psychological dynamic was a terrifying, suffocating labyrinth of conditional love and exploitation. There was my younger sister, Isla. If you looked up the clinical definition of a golden child, her picture would be perfectly framed next to it. Isla was effortlessly beautiful, violently allergic to hard work, and possessed a deeply ingrained delusional sense of entitlement. She walked through life leaving a trail of expensive perfume, failed college semesters, and massive credit card debt. While I was forced to work a miserable retail job in high school to pay for my own textbooks, Isla was given a brand new Mercedes for passing her sophomore year. The psychological dynamic in our household relied heavily on a concept called conditional self-worth. I was the scapegoat. I was only acknowledged when I was solving a problem or paying for a mistake. If Isla crashed her car while driving under the influence, Lucille wouldn't discipline her. She would look at me with wide, pitiful eyes and deploy her signature fake sweet, syrupy tone to completely invalidate my anger. "Oh, Serafina, sweetie," Lucille would sigh, gently placing a manicured hand on my shoulder as if I were a confused, aggressive animal. "Your sister is just so fragile. She's highly sensitive. She doesn't have your thick skin. You just have to be the bigger person and use your savings to cover her legal fees so she doesn't get a record. Don't cause drama where there doesn't need to be any. Family comes first." They didn't want peace. They wanted my silent, endless financial compliance. They pathologized my anger and weaponized my empathy. So the moment I turned 18, I ran. I didn't walk away. I sprinted. I refused their toxic requests for money and went to war with my own poverty. I paid my way through pre-med and medical school by working night shifts in hospital administration, surviving on cold coffee, adrenaline, and an agonizing, meticulous fear of failure. I channeled my childhood trauma, the constant need to fix what was broken, to find order in chaos, into my career. I became a neurosurgeon. I spent 80-hour weeks in the operating room, dissecting the most complex, fragile networks in the human body. I built a reputation as one of the most brilliant, steady-handed surgeons in the state. By the time I was 34, I was pulling down a massive 7-figure salary and acting as the primary director for a prestigious pediatric neurology research fund. I was wealthy, fiercely independent, and commanded a room full of men twice my age. But independence can be incredibly lonely. And in my desperate, stupid desire to build a normal family, I got engaged to Julian. Julian was a mid-level executive at a pharmaceutical marketing firm. He was handsome, charming, and possessed an easygoing demeanor that I mistook for stability. I didn't realize that beneath his polished exterior was a deeply insecure, greedy man who was secretly intimidated by my earning power and my intellect. I paid the mortgage on our luxury penthouse. I bought his car. I funded our lifestyle. I didn't know it, but my financial dominance was emasculating him. And in his pathetic search to feel like a powerful man, he found the perfect willing audience in my sister. Isla, who thrived on stealing anything that belonged to me, was more than happy to stroke his fragile ego behind my back. The illusion of my perfect life began to shatter 3 months before my wedding. It started with a scent. I came home early from a grueling 12-hour surgical rotation. The penthouse was quiet. Julian was in the shower. I walked into our master bedroom, intending to hang up his suit jacket that he had carelessly thrown across the bed. As I picked up the jacket, a scent hit me. It wasn't Julian's cologne. It was a heavy, distinct, suffocating floral perfume. Baccarat Rouge 540. It was the exact signature perfume I had bought for my sister, Isla, for her birthday. My heart didn't break, it stopped. The analytical, surgical part of my brain instantly kicked in. I didn't scream, I didn't confront him in the shower. I carefully put the jacket back exactly where I found it, walked into my home office, locked the door, and opened my laptop. I logged into our joint bank accounts. I started looking for the truth hiding between the margins. I didn't just find evidence of an affair, I found the blueprint for my absolute destruction. Julian wasn't just buying Isla expensive hotel rooms and designer bags, he was hemorrhaging money. He had massive, catastrophic gambling debts buried under layers of secret credit cards and loans that were entirely in his name. He was millions of dollars in debt, and his creditors were getting aggressive. But that wasn't what made the blood freeze in my veins. While digging through the financial routing numbers, I noticed a massive discrepancy in my own personal accounts. Specifically, the accounts linked to the security credentials I used for the hospital's pediatric research fund. Over the past 6 months, exactly $2 million had been systematically, quietly siphoned out of the research fund, routed through my personal IP address, and deposited into a complex web of offshore shell companies. Someone had stolen my security credentials, hacked my personal network, and used my identity to embezzle $2 million from dying children. And based on the IP logs, the transfers were executed from my home network. On days when I was logged into the hospital operating room, performing surgery, there was only one other person who had access to my home network and my personal devices: Julian. He hadn't just cheated on me with my sister. He had framed me for a massive, career-ending federal felony to pay off his gambling debts. Let me pause right here and step out of the story for a second. Have you ever discovered a betrayal so profound, so meticulously cruel, that it transcended anger and became something cold and terrifying? Have you ever realized that the person sleeping next to you was actively trying to destroy your life? What do you do in that exact moment? Do you pack your bags and run? Do you confront them? Tell me your story in the comments below. Trust me, getting it out into the open helps, because as I sat in my home office, staring at the evidence of my impending ruin, I knew confronting him would be suicide. If I confronted Julian, he would panic. He would destroy the evidence, and I would be left holding the bag for the embezzled $2 million. I needed more proof. I needed an ironclad defense. I had absolutely no idea that Julian and my family weren't just planning to send me to prison. They were planning to send me to the morgue. I didn't confront Julian. I spent the next 3 days operating in a state of absolute, terrifying hyperfocus. I performed complex neurosurgeries during the day with hands that never trembled, and at night I became a digital ghost in my own home. I covertly hired a private investigator, a former forensic accountant named Elias, whom I had treated years ago for a spinal injury. Elias owed me his mobility, and he was fiercely loyal. I gave him the routing numbers of the offshore shell companies Julian had used. Track the money, Elias, I told him over a secure encrypted line. Find out exactly where that $2 million went. I need to know who he paid off. While Elias hunted the digital trail, the trap Julian had set for me violently sprang shut. It happened on a Thursday morning. I was in the scrub room at the hospital, washing my hands, preparing for a delicate 8-hour tumor resection on a 7-year-old girl. The heavy, sterile doors of the scrub room swung open. It wasn't a surgical nurse. It was the hospital's chief of medicine, flanked by 2 armed police officers and a detective. "Dr. Sterling," the chief of medicine said, his voice trembling, his face pale with a mixture of shock and disgust. "I need you to step away from the sink. Your surgical privileges have been immediately suspended." The detective stepped forward, holding up a badge and a thick file. "Serafina Sterling, you are under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, and the embezzlement of $2 million from the Pediatric Research Fund." They handcuffed me in my surgical scrubs, right in front of the horrified nurses and my surgical team. They marched me through the main corridors of the hospital I had dedicated my life to, performing a public, humiliating execution of my reputation. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I kept my head high, knowing that any display of emotion would be used against me as erratic behavior. I was held in a county jail cell for 48 hours before my bail hearing. During those 2 days, the narrative outside was meticulously crafted. Julian didn't come to visit me. Instead, my mother, Lucille, went on the local news. I watched her performance on the small, grainy TV mounted in the holding area. She wore a modest, dark dress, her face devoid of makeup, looking like the devastated matriarch of a broken family. "My daughter has been under immense, unimaginable pressure," Lucille wept for the cameras, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "The stress of the surgeries, it broke her. We've noticed her becoming paranoid, erratic, and obsessive over the past year. We begged her to get psychiatric help. We never imagined the delusions would drive her to do something so horrific, so entirely out of character. We are heartbroken for the hospital, and we are heartbroken for Serafina. She didn't just abandon me, she pathologized me. She fed the media the exact narrative they needed. The brilliant, high-strung surgeon who cracked under pressure, lost her mind, and stole the money in a manic, delusional episode. By the time I posted bail, utilizing the last of my untouched personal savings, my life was completely unrecognizable. My medical license was suspended pending the trial. My bank accounts were frozen. My penthouse was a crime scene. I moved into a cheap, nondescript motel on the edge of the city. The very next day, Elias called me on a burner phone. "I tracked the money, Serafina," Elias said, his voice grim, lacking any of his usual sharp confidence. "Julian didn't use the $2 million to pay off his gambling debts." "What do you mean?" I asked, pacing the stained carpet of the motel room. "Where did the money go?" He washed it through 3 offshore accounts, brought it back stateside, and used it to purchase a premium, lump sum, absolute payout financial product, Elias explained, pausing heavily. Serafina, Julian and your mother bought a $10 million life insurance policy on you. The air completely left my lungs. The motel room tilted violently. A life insurance policy? I whispered, my brain struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated evil of the calculation. But I'm going to prison. You don't get a payout if I'm in prison. No, you don't, Elias replied, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. But you do get a payout if the disgraced, mentally unstable, ruined surgeon commits suicide in her holding cell before the sentencing. The horror was absolute. It wasn't just a frame-up, it was a premeditated assassination plot. Julian and Lucille knew that an embezzlement trial would ruin me. They knew I would be facing decades in prison. Their plan was brilliant in its sociopathy. Isolate me, destroy my reputation, label me as suicidal and mentally unstable to the press, and then, once I was locked away, arrange for me to have a fatal accident. The narrative was already built. The disgraced doctor couldn't handle the shame and took her own life. And then, Julian and Lucille would collect $10 million, tax-free. I sat on the edge of the cheap motel bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper. I had spent my life fixing broken things, saving lives, and operating by the rules. I had believed that if I was just good enough, smart enough, and worked hard enough, I would be safe. But you cannot outwork pure evil. You have to destroy it. I didn't call the police. The police believed the IP logs that Julian had forged. They believed my mother's tears on television. If I went to them screaming about a murder plot, they would just add paranoid delusions to my file. I needed a higher power. I needed the people who specialize in the one crime worse than murder: defrauding the federal government. I contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Insurance Fraud Division and the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit. I met with 2 federal agents in a secure, windowless room in a federal building. I laid out the entire, meticulously documented trail Elias had found. I showed them how the embezzled hospital funds were routed offshore and used to purchase the illicit life insurance policy. They used stolen, laundered money to purchase a fraudulent financial instrument across state and international lines, I explained clinically to the agents, and they are currently conspiring to commit murder for hire to execute the payout. But if you arrest them now, they will claim the offshore accounts belong to me, and that I bought the policy myself in a manic episode. The lead agent, a sharp, imposing woman named Agent Harris, reviewed the file. She looked up at me, her eyes narrowing. You're right. The circumstantial evidence against you is heavy. We need them to confess to the intent. We need them to definitively tie themselves to the policy and the motive. I know, I replied smoothly, which is why I am going to give them exactly what they want. Agent Harris raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? I am going to plead guilty, I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. I am going to stand in that courtroom, look the judge in the eye, and accept a 10-year prison sentence. Dr. Sterling, if you plead guilty, you will be remanded into federal custody immediately, Harris warned. We cannot guarantee your safety inside if they have already hired someone to kill you. I don't need you to protect me inside, I countered. I need you to let them think they've won. Because the moment I am sentenced, Julian and Lucille will initiate the claim process on the life insurance policy, assuming my death is imminent. The moment they sign those claim documents, they commit federal mail and wire fraud, and they legally tie themselves to the laundered money. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the metal table. I am the bait. Let them swallow the hook. And then we pull the line. For the next 4 months, I played the role of the broken, defeated woman perfectly. I sat silently through the grueling pre-trial hearings. I watched Julian and Isla sit in the gallery, holding hands, barely concealing their triumphant smirks. I watched Lucille dab her eyes for the cameras outside the courthouse. I instructed my public defender, I pretended I couldn't afford a real lawyer, to negotiate a plea deal. I would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence. The trap was fully set. It just needed to be sprung on the biggest stage possible. Which brings us right back to the courtroom. Let's rewind the tape to the exact moment we started. The sterile, wood-paneled courtroom. The heavy steel chains around my wrists. The suffocating weight of the orange jumpsuit. The gallery packed with whispering colleagues and hungry journalists. The judge, a stern man with white hair, looked down at me from his elevated bench. "Serafina Sterling," the judge's voice echoed through the silent room, "you have pleaded guilty to grand larceny, wire fraud, and the embezzlement of $2 million from a pediatric research fund. These are crimes of profound moral turpitude, violating the very core of the Hippocratic oath you swore to uphold." I didn't flinch. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead. In the front row, I could hear Lucille let out a soft, theatrical sob. I saw Julian squeeze her hand. I saw Isla checking her reflection in her phone screen, the diamond engagement ring, my ring, flashing in the fluorescent light. "Before I pronounce sentencing," the judge continued, looking at his notes, "does the defense have anything further to add?" My public defender, a tired-looking man who was completely unaware of the federal operation, stood up. "No, Your Honor, the defense rests." "Very well," the judge said, raising his wooden gavel. "Serafina Sterling, I hereby sentence you to—" "Objection, Your Honor." The voice didn't come from my public defender. It came from the heavy double oak doors at the back of the courtroom. The entire gallery whipped around. The judge frowned, his gavel hovering in midair. Walking down the center aisle of the courtroom was not a local lawyer. It was a man wearing a sharp, dark suit, carrying a thick, heavy, federal-stamped leather binder. Flanking him were 4 armed men and women wearing bulletproof vests, clearly marked with the yellow letters FBI. The silence in the courtroom shattered into a chaotic, murmuring wave of shock. Julian, sitting in the front row, froze entirely. The smug, victorious smirk vanished from his face, replaced by absolute, visceral terror. Lucille dropped her tissue, her jaw going slack. Isla looked confused, grabbing Julian's arm. The man in the suit walked past the wooden divider, flashing a federal badge to the bailiff. He approached the bench. "Your Honor, my name is Special Agent Miller, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Insurance Fraud, and Financial Crimes Division," the agent announced, his voice booming over the chaos of the room. "I am submitting an emergency federal injunction to halt this sentencing immediately." The judge lowered his gavel, looking utterly bewildered. "On what grounds, Agent Miller?" "On the grounds that the evidence used to secure this conviction was entirely fabricated, Your Honor," Agent Miller stated clinically, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent, staring gallery. "And the defendant, Dr. Sterling, has been operating as a confidential federal informant for the past 5 months. The collective gasp that ripped through the courtroom was so violent it felt as if the oxygen had been physically vacuumed out of the room. The journalists in the back rows scrambled, pens flying across notepads. My former colleagues stared at me, their eyes wide with shock. But it was the reaction of my family that I will savor for the rest of my life. Julian, still clutching my mother's hand, turned the color of ash. He tried to stand up, but his legs failed him, and he sank heavily back onto the wooden bench. Lucille looked as if she had just been struck by lightning. Her perfectly powdered face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Isla let out a high-pitched, confused whine. Realizing the spotlight was no longer on her, they thought they had buried me. Now, I was standing in a courtroom, flanked by federal agents, wearing an orange jumpsuit that was suddenly looking less like a prison uniform and more like a tactical disguise. "Explain yourself, Agent Miller," the judge demanded, his tone shifting from stern judgment to sharp, intense curiosity. 3 days ago, Your Honor," Agent Miller began, projecting his voice so every single person in the room could hear the execution. "The individuals in the front row, Julian Vance and Lucille Bennett, initiated a claim on a $10 million offshore life insurance policy registered in the defendant's name." The judge frowned. "A life insurance claim? Dr. Sterling is standing right in front of us." "Yes, Your Honor," Agent Miller replied, a cold, predatory edge entering his voice. They initiated the preliminary payout process under the assumption that Dr. Sterling's death in a federal holding facility was imminent and guaranteed. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The implication was horrifyingly clear. Furthermore, Your Honor, Agent Miller continued, pulling a thick stack of documents from his leather binder and handing them up to the bench. We have cryptographically verified that the $2 million embezzled from the hospital, the crime Dr. Sterling is currently being sentenced for, was routed through offshore shell companies controlled entirely by Julian Vance. Those stolen funds were then used to purchase the illicit life insurance policy. That's a lie! Julian suddenly shrieked, his voice cracking, a high, panicked squeak that shattered his polished facade. He pointed a shaking finger at me. She's lying! She set this up! She hacked the accounts to frame me! Sit down and remain silent, Mr. Vance, the judge barked, banging his gavel sharply. He looked down at the federal documents, his eyes scanning the irrefutable evidence. He looked up, his expression shifting to absolute disgust. You didn't just steal the money, Mr. Vance, the judge stated, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. You attempted to utilize the judicial system to isolate a woman, frame her for a federal felony, and orchestrate her murder for a $10 million payout. Lucille let out a shrill, hysterical shriek, burying her face in her hands, her carefully constructed high society facade completely destroyed. No, please, there's a mistake. Julian told me it was a legal investment. He tricked me. Don't you dare blame this on me, you greedy old witch, Julian roared, violently shoving Lucille away from him. You bought the policy. You hired the guy inside the prison. They were instantly cannibalizing each other. The illusion of family loyalty evaporated the moment the federal spotlight hit them. They were just two parasites fighting over a sinking ship. I didn't turn around to look at them. I kept my eyes fixed on the judge. Dr. Sterling, the judge said, his voice softening considerably, addressing me with the respect my title demanded. I am vacating your guilty plea immediately. All charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice. You are a free woman. The bailiff stepped forward with a heavy set of keys. He unlocked the steel cuffs around my wrists. The heavy chains fell to the floor with a loud metallic clang. I rubbed my bruised wrists, feeling the blood flow back into my hands. I turned around slowly, facing the gallery, and looked directly at the front row. Arrest them, Agent Miller commanded, nodding to the armed agents standing by the doors. The execution was absolute. 4 agents moved in simultaneously. They grabbed Julian's arms, hauling him out of the wooden pew. He fought them, kicking and screaming, sobbing loudly, begging the judge, begging me for mercy. Click, click. The heavy metal handcuffs locked around the cheating husband's wrists. Lucille didn't fight. The arrogant matriarch simply collapsed onto the floor of the courtroom, weeping hysterically, clutching her chest, looking like a hollowed-out, pathetic shell of a woman. And Isla, the golden child, was screaming, not out of grief for her mother, but out of pure, selfish terror as an agent grabbed her arm. Get off me! I didn't do anything! Isla shrieked, her diamond engagement ring catching the harsh courtroom lights. I didn't know about the insurance. I just slept with him. That's not a crime. No, ma'am, it's not, the agent replied coldly. But signing as a secondary beneficiary on an illicit life insurance policy purchased with stolen funds makes you an accessory to federal wire fraud. Hands behind your back. As the agents hauled my sobbing sister, my broken mother, and my ruined fiancé down the center aisle of the courtroom, past the frantic flashes of the press cameras, Julian looked back at me one last time. His eyes were wide with a mixture of horror, awe, and utter despair. Serafina, please, Julian cried out, his voice cracking. I'm sorry. I love you. Please don't do this. I stood in the center of the courtroom, wearing the orange jumpsuit they had designed for my funeral. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. The frightened, abandoned scapegoat was gone. The brilliant, steady-handed surgeon remained. I looked at the man who had tried to murder me, and I offered a slow, chilling, utterly peaceful smile. You think $10 million can buy my life, Julian? I asked softly, my voice carrying perfectly across the silent, staring gallery. I save lives for a living. I know exactly what they're worth. Enjoy federal prison. I hear the healthcare is terrible. Let's pause one last time. I stood in that courtroom, watching the FBI drag my toxic family and my cheating fiancé out in handcuffs, completely dismantling their lives, the very trap they sprang themselves. Have you ever had to execute a brutal, uncompromising boundary to protect yourself from the people who were supposed to love you? Did you show them mercy? Or did you drop the receipts and let the law handle them? Tell me your verdict in the comments, because let me tell you what happened in the aftermath of that spectacular trial. The federal justice system does not negotiate with arrogance, and it certainly does not forgive conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain, because the evidence I provided was cryptographically verified, heavily documented, and supported by their own intercepted communications regarding the prison hit. The prosecution was swift and merciless. Julian, terrified of spending his life in a maximum security prison, immediately tried to turn on my mother. He took a plea deal, testifying that Lucille had orchestrated the entire plot. Despite his cooperation, because he was the one who physically executed the embezzlement and purchased the fraudulent policy, Julian was sentenced to 25 years in a federal penitentiary. Lucille faced the most devastating downfall of all. She was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The high society friends she had spent her life trying to impress abandoned her instantly, terrified of the scandal. She wept in the courtroom, claiming she was just a desperate mother trying to provide for her youngest daughter. The judge didn't care. Ignorance and vanity are not defenses against attempted murder. She was sentenced to 20 years. She will likely die in prison. Ella, the golden child who thought she had successfully stolen my life, was indicted as a co-conspirator. The prosecution highlighted her signature on the beneficiary documents and her complicity in the embezzlement. She was sentenced to 5 years in a minimum security federal facility. Her designer wardrobe, her luxury car, and whatever assets she had left were seized by the government to pay her astronomical legal fees. As for me, the hospital, horrified by the revelation and deeply embarrassed by their quick rush to judgment, issued a massive public apology. My medical license was instantly reinstated with full honors. I didn't sue them. I knew they were just reacting to Julian's flawless, fabricated evidence. However, I didn't return to that hospital. The culture of quick judgments and whispered rumors held too many ghosts. I took the massive settlement I received from the offshore insurance company, who paid me handsomely to avoid being implicated in the federal fraud investigation, and moved to a quiet, beautiful city in the Pacific Northwest. I opened my own private pediatric neurology practice, consulting on my own terms. I live in a stunning, highly secure home, surrounded by colleagues and friends who celebrate my brilliance, not my utility. Looking back, the moment the police cuffed me in the scrub room was the most terrifying moment of my life. But it taught me a profound, agonizing lesson about the illusion of family loyalty and the absolute necessity of ironclad boundaries. When you grow up as the scapegoat, toxic families will try to convince you that your only value is what you can provide for them. They will use your skills, your money, and your very identity, all while telling you that you are fundamentally unlovable. They rely on your desperate need for their approval to keep you compliant. They mistook my empathy for weakness. They thought that because I loved them, I wouldn't fight back. They thought that because I saved lives, I didn't know how to destroy them. But empathy without boundaries is just self-destruction. If you are watching this, and you are currently trapped in a family dynamic where your sacrifices are ignored, where a golden child is worshipped, or where your partner demands your loyalty while secretly plotting your ruin, hear me now. You owe them absolutely nothing. Blood does not give them the right to cannibalize your life. You are allowed to stop fixing their messes. You are allowed to stop trying to earn love from people who are incapable of giving it. Build your wealth in the dark. Educate yourself. Learn the rules of the game they think they are playing. Let them underestimate you. Let them mistake your silence for compliance. And then, when the time is right, use the cold, hard truth to legally burn their delusions to the ground. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, or if you just love a perfectly executed, legally binding checkmate, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own power. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next story.